Martha Holloway sat alone on her porch, staring at the barren fields that used to be alive with crops. The sun beat down mercilessly, but it didn't bother her anymore. Not the heat, not the endless dust, not the empty silence that surrounded her. It had been years since her family had died, and now it felt as though everything around her had died with them. The farm, once thriving and bustling with life, now looked like a forgotten relic of a time long past. The fence posts leaned at awkward angles, and the barn door hung from a single hinge, rusted and falling apart. Weeds overtook what used to be her vegetable garden, and the dirt that used to grow life now lay dry and cracked. Martha had given up on it all. The future, the farm, even the sunrise that came each morning creeping through the cracked windows of her house. The only thing left was the loneliness. She could have ignored the boy at the gate. He looked hungry, dirty, and out of place. She'd seen children like him before, orphans from failed settlements, drifting with nowhere to go. They were all the same, just another face in a sea of forgotten souls. But something about the way he stood there caught her attention. His eyes weren't like the others she had seen. They weren't pleading or begging, they were determined. He didn't ask for pity, he wasn't demanding anything. He just waited. Martha stared at him for a long time, from the safety of her porch. His clothes hung loosely on his thin frame, much too big for his body, like hand-me-downs from an older child. His hair was unkempt, the color of wheat before harvest, and he had the look of someone who'd walked far, too far, for someone so young. He wasn't asking for food. He wasn't asking for shelter. He was asking for something more. He was offering hope when Martha had already given hers up. For a moment she hesitated. She had learned to turn her back on everyone and everything. She had learned to let the world pass by without reaching out. But this boy, standing in the dust with nothing but a torn satchel, was different. He was offering something she hadn't seen in years' hope. She walked toward the gate, each step feeling heavier than the last. The boy shifted his weight nervously, but he didn't back away. His hands were trembling, but his face was calm. "Can I help you?" Martha asked, her voice cracking from disuse. The boy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around, taking in the dilapidated farm, the broken barn, the withered crops. His eyes lingered on the empty fields, but then he turned to her with a steady gaze. "I've been walking for 2 days," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was told you might need help. I can work for food or shelter." Martha's chest tightened. This boy had walked 2 days alone with nothing but a satchel to carry his belongings. And he wasn't asking for charity. He was offering to work, to help. She didn't know what to say. What could she say? She had nothing left to give. But somehow, without thinking, her feet moved before her mind could stop them. She opened the gate and motioned for him to come inside. "Come in," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'll fix you something to eat." The boy hesitated for only a moment before stepping onto her property. As he crossed the threshold, she saw his eyes take in every detail of the house, the same house that had once been full of laughter, warmth, and life. Now it was nothing but dust and silence. But something about the way the boy looked at it made Martha feel like it was worth saving. They entered the house, and the creaky door groaned as it shut behind them. The inside was no better than the outside. Dust covered every surface, and the fireplace had long since gone cold. The air was thick with the smell of stale bread and the absence of life. Martha moved to the kitchen, her movements slow and deliberate. She gathered what little food she had left, some stale bread, a jar of preserves, and some water from the well. She didn't look at the boy as she worked. She didn't know what to say to him. He sat at the small table, his hands folded in his lap, watching her without judgment. It was strange. He wasn't looking at her like everyone else had, like she was a broken thing that couldn't be fixed. He looked at her like he saw something else, something she hadn't seen in years. They ate in silence. Martha wasn't sure how long it had been since she had shared a meal with another person, but it felt good to have someone there, even if just for a moment. When they finished, the boy cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Can I see the barn?" "I've worked with livestock before. I might be able to help." Martha almost laughed. The barn was falling apart, the roof had partially collapsed, and the weeds had overtaken it, but the boy didn't see it like that. He saw potential, he saw something worth saving. Sure, she said, and they walked outside. The barn was even worse than the house. The walls were cracked and the floor was covered in debris. But the boy moved through it with purpose, pointing out the beams that could be saved, the walls that could be repaired. Martha watched him work, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of something inside her. Hope, perhaps. Or maybe it was the realization that the boy was offering her something more than help. He was offering her a chance to fight for this place, for the life she had let slip away. And then he said something that stopped her in her tracks. "I heard about you in town," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I'm sorry for your loss." Martha's heart clenched at the mention of her family. The pain was still so fresh, so raw. She had lost her husband, her children, all in the span of a few months. And yet here was this boy who had lost everything too, offering her words of comfort. "I understand what it's like to lose people," he continued. "I lost my family too. But I'm still here, and I want to help you." Martha stared at him for a long moment. His eyes, full of sadness and understanding, reminded her of her own children, the ones she had buried so long ago. "Who did you lose?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy looked down at the ground for a moment, his face clouded with pain. "My parents died in a wagon accident. I've been living with my uncle since then, but—" His voice trailed off. Martha knew what came next. She could see it in the boy's eyes, the way he avoided looking at her. His uncle had thrown him away, just like so many others. "Where's your uncle now?" Martha asked, her voice sharp with anger. "He's with his new wife," Caleb said quietly. "They don't want me anymore. I'm too much of a burden. I can't work as hard as the other kids because of my leg." Martha felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. How could someone throw away a child? How could they abandon him just because he couldn't work as hard as they wanted him to? She looked at Caleb, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in years, protection. Without thinking, she asked him a question that surprised both of them. "Do you have anywhere else to go?" Caleb shook his head. "No, ma'am." "I don't—" For a moment Martha stood frozen, unsure of what to do. She had spent so long convincing herself that she was better off alone. But standing here with this boy who had lost everything just like she had, she realized something. Maybe they didn't have to be alone anymore. "Caleb," she said softly, her voice trembling with something she couldn't name. "You can stay here. You don't have to go anywhere." The boy's face lit up with surprise, and for the first time since she had met him, Martha saw hope in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "I won't let you down." Martha looked at him, feeling something stir deep inside her. She had given up on life, on hope, on everything. But in that moment she realized that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start again. The days that followed were filled with more work than Martha had seen in years. Caleb seemed to breathe new life into the farm. Where Martha had once seen only ruins and failure, he saw potential and purpose. Together, they began the painstaking process of bringing the farm back to life. Caleb worked from dawn until dusk, fixing fences, repairing the barn, and even tending to the animals Martha hadn't touched in months. He moved with a determination that matched his spirit, despite the limp in his step. Martha found herself working alongside him, her hands rough and calloused again, but with a renewed sense of purpose she hadn't known in a long time. She noticed the way Caleb never complained, never asked for anything more than what he was given. It was as though the boy had learned to live with nothing and still give everything he had to others. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Caleb called out to her from the barn. Martha walked over, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. The barn was taking shape again, its walls slowly being repaired, and the roof was starting to look solid for the first time in years. "Martha," Caleb said as she approached, his voice steady but with an underlying tone of something serious. "I've been thinking," Martha glanced up at him. "About what?" "I think I should go back to town. I know I've got a lot of work to do here, but—" He hesitated, looking at the ground for a moment before meeting her eyes. "I need to find out what happened to my uncle." Martha's heart tightened at the mention of Caleb's uncle. The man who had abandoned him, the man who had sold him for a debt he couldn't pay. She hadn't wanted Caleb to go near him, not after everything he'd been through. But she understood that Caleb needed closure, needed to know what had happened to the man who was supposed to be his family, even if that man didn't deserve his loyalty. "I understand," she said softly, walking over to him. "But you're not going alone." Caleb blinked in surprise. "You're coming with me?" "I think it's time we find out what kind of man he really is," Martha replied, her voice firm but gentle. "And I don't want you to face it alone." Caleb looked at her, his expression filled with gratitude, but also a tinge of uncertainty. "You really don't have to do this. I don't want to cause any more trouble." "Caleb," Martha said, reaching out to place a hand on his shoulder, "you're not causing trouble. You're doing what anyone would do. You're looking for the truth. And I'm not going to let you face it alone." The next morning, they packed what little supplies they had. Caleb took his satchel, still worn and ragged, and Martha grabbed her husband's rifle. It was the only weapon she had, but it was enough to make sure they weren't caught off guard. They traveled for miles, the heat of the day pressing down on them as they made their way toward the town. Martha couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. She wasn't sure what they would find when they got there, but she knew that facing Caleb's uncle would be a reckoning. By the time they reached the outskirts of the town, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dirt roads. Martha and Caleb entered the town quietly, their eyes scanning the unfamiliar faces, but no one seemed to pay them much attention. The dusty main street was quiet, save for the occasional horse and rider passing by. They made their way to the saloon where Caleb said his uncle had spent most of his time. The building was dark, the sound of laughter and shouting coming from inside. Martha felt a pang of fear in her chest. She didn't know what to expect, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. Caleb hesitated at the door, but Martha gave him a reassuring nod. "Let's go." They stepped inside, and the noise seemed to quiet for a moment. Everyone's eyes turned to them, but Martha didn't flinch. She kept her gaze steady, focused on what was ahead. Caleb led the way, moving toward the back of the saloon where his uncle was likely to be. There, sitting at a table, was Caleb's uncle, the man who had sold his nephew for the sake of his own debts. He was older than Caleb, with a hard, weathered face that spoke of too many years spent chasing comfort and wealth at the expense of everyone around him. When he saw Caleb and Martha, his eyes hardened, and for a moment there was silence between them. "Well, well," the uncle said, his voice rough and cold. "If it isn't the little runaway?" Martha could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. She had expected him to be angry, but she didn't expect the bitterness that radiated from him. "Uncle, I came to talk," Caleb said quietly. "I want to know what happened to me." "To my family," the man sneered. "Your family? You mean the family I had to take care of after you lost everything?" "I had my own problems, boy. I don't owe you anything." Martha stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with the anger she could no longer contain. "You owe him everything. You took him in when his parents died, but you abandoned him when things got tough. And now you're here, pretending like you didn't sell your own blood just to settle a debt." The uncle stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing as he took in Martha's words. He didn't speak at first, but his hands twitched toward his belt. Martha didn't flinch. She kept her gaze locked with his, unshaken. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat. "You think it's easy out here? You think I had a choice?" His voice was rising now, filled with venom. "I did what I had to do to survive." Caleb stepped back, his face pale as he looked at the man who had once been his guardian. "I'm done surviving, Uncle. I'm done with you." For a moment there was nothing but silence. The air seemed to thicken with the weight of Caleb's words. And then Martha spoke again, her voice low but firm. "Caleb's right. You're done here. No more running. No more hiding." Before anything more could be said, a noise from the doorway broke the silence. 3 men had entered the saloon, their faces cold and unreadable. Martha's heart dropped when she saw the familiar scarred face of Vance, the leader of the men who had come to her farm days earlier. "Looks like the boy's uncle has some company," Vance said with a smirk, looking at Caleb and Martha. Caleb's uncle looked at the men, his face paling. "What is this?" he asked, his voice cracking. "You know what this is?" Vance replied, stepping closer, his hand resting on the gun at his side. "We've come to collect." "That's all?" "Hand over the boy." Martha's blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. These men weren't just debt collectors. They were hunters, and Caleb was their prey.